There comes a moment, quiet, often unannounced, when the scaffolding of your life begins to tremble. From the outside, nothing has changed. The same routines, the same people, the same obligations remain. But something within has shifted. A subtle fracture forms between your outer performance and your inner reality. The roles you once played begin to feel hollow. The words you speak feel foreign in your mouth. What once offered security now suffocates, and you cannot explain why. This is the first tremor of a true spiritual awakening, a silent inner crisis disguised as boredom, fatigue, or a loss of meaning. It is not dramatic, it is existential. Carl Jung described this as the beginning of individuation, a process in which the soul, long silenced by the demands of the persona, begins to stir. Not with answers, but with an ache that whispers, "This cannot be all there is." You feel it not as inspiration, but as unease, a sacred dissatisfaction, a deep intuition that something essential lies beyond the surface of things, beyond the narratives you've been given. The world continues on with its noise, but your inner world starts to unravel. Meaning leaks through the seams of your daily life, and yet within this unraveling, a strange clarity begins to form. You are being called. Spiritual awakening is not an ascent. It begins as a descent into yourself, into the unknown. It is not about light, not yet. It begins in the shadowy threshold where the ego falters and the soul begins to remember itself. Jung taught that transformation is not found in chasing ideals, but in facing the inner breakdown with honesty. In that collapse of false peace, something real begins to emerge. Not perfection, not bliss, but the first breath of truth. This is the first stage, the rupture. The awakening begins not when you seek answers, but when the questions begin to shake the foundations of your former self. The call is not always loud, but it is always real, and it is asking for your attention. After the rapture comes the restless fire of inquiry. The second stage of awakening is the search, and it arrives like a sacred hunger. Once the soul begins to stir, it refuses passivity. You begin to ask questions that no book can fully answer. And yet you turn to books. You dive into teachings both ancient and modern, hoping that something, somewhere will mirror the inner shift now unfolding. You meditate, journal, pray, experiment with rituals and philosophies. You attend workshops, chase symbols, follow synchronicities. You become a pilgrim of inner meaning. There is a beauty here, raw and electric. One line in a book cracks something open. A dream leaves an imprint that lingers for days. A chance encounter feels divinely placed. This is the realm where the collective unconscious opens a subtle door and whispers, "You are not alone. Others have walked this way before." You feel less lost. The seeker in you awakens. But in the rush to consume truth, a danger emerges. The ego, threatened by the soul's call, can cleverly cloak itself in spiritual language. It transforms the search into an escape. You collect practices without integration. You chase insights without grounding. You accumulate symbols without embodying their meaning. Spiritual overload sets in, not from too much depth, but from too little digestion. Carl Jung warned of this. Individuation is not about becoming everything. It is about becoming yourself. And so the search must evolve. From frantic consumption to sacred discernment, from chasing novelty to cultivating silence. The psyche begins to sift. What resonates remains, what distracts fades. The true self does not shout to be found, it reveals itself in the quiet. Eventually, the seeker pauses, not because they have arrived, but because they have begun to listen differently. There is space now between the inputs, a stillness beneath the noise, and in that space, the first flickers of the authentic self begin to pulse. not as knowledge, but as presence, not as theory, but as truth remembered. This is no longer about learning. It is about returning. The search is still alive, but now it bends inward. It no longer asks what the world has to offer. It asks what your soul has come to reveal. After the restless seeking and spiritual experimentation, something subtle begins to shift, not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with a whisper. A dream lingers longer than usual. A sentence in a book feels like it was written just for you. The symbol repeats itself across the day in ways that feel eerily personal. These are not coincidences. They are signals. And in the Jungian language, they are the language of the self, the organizing center of the psyche that calls you not to perform, but to become. This is the stage of illumination, when something deeper than intellect stirs awake within you. The soul, which had been searching outward for answers, begins to speak inwardly, not with logic, but with knowing. You do not will these experiences into being. They arise unbidden, like echoes from some deeper chamber of the mind you didn't know existed. A sense of recognition dawns, not because you have found something new, but because something ancient in you has finally been remembered. Jung taught that the self does not arrive in the form of doctrines or fixed ideologies. It arrives through dreams, creative urges, and inner certainties that defy rational proof. It is the quiet coherence you feel when something resonates deeply, even if you cannot explain why. This stage is not about having all the answers. It is about recognizing, however briefly, that there is a guiding presence within you, one that knows the way. You may still doubt it, you may still question, but you are no longer lost in the same way, because the glimpse of the self leaves a mark. It changes the texture of your inner life, and even when confusion returns, you carry within you the memory of that clarity. A moment when you touched the truth not with thought, but with your being. That is enough to carry you forward. As the light of the self begins to flicker through the cracks, a subtle war ignites within. This is the stage of resistance, and it is not a weakness. It is part of the path. The ego, startled by the trembling of its old architecture, begins to tighten its grip. It wants to hold the lines, maintain order, restore what once made sense. The familiar calls like a siren. Old routines beckon with the false promise of safety. But what once felt comforting now begins to constrict. It is as though the walls you built to protect yourself have become the very prison from which your soul longs to escape. Jung observed that the ego does not surrender easily. It resists not out of malice, but out of fear. To welcome the unknown is to threaten everything it has created to survive. So it retreats into its fortress of habit. It questions the signs you once trusted. Was that dream real? Did that synchronicity mean anything? Maybe it was all just imagination. Doubt becomes its armor, skepticism its voice. But beneath the noise, a quieter presence still whispers. The self has spoken, and no amount of denial can erase what has already been glimpsed. This is not a failure of the journey. It is its crucible. Resistance is not regression. It is the tension between death and rebirth. One part of you longs to leap, another clings to the edge. And this inner conflict drains you. Fatigue sets in, not just physical, but psychic. You feel torn between two lives, the one you built and the one trying to be born. You are not wrong to feel this way. In fact, it means you are precisely where you need to be. Eventually, something inside yields, not in defeat, but in truth. The ego begins to understand that control is no longer tenable. Surrender does not come as a grand revelation. It arrives gently, a breath, a moment, a quiet softening, and this is the beginning of something new. A humility that does not seek to dominate, but to integrate it. Jung taught that awakening moves in spirals, not straight lines. It flows forward, then circles back. It asks not for perfection, but for presence. What helps now is not more effort, but more honesty. Honesty about your fear, your clinging, your grief. When you name it, you begin to reclaim it. And when resistance is seen for what it is, a defense, not a destiny, it begins to dissolve. Not because you forced it to, but because you understood it. After the long tension of resistance, a threshold opens. Not into light, but into the abyss. This is the moment when the unconscious rises, not as a soft whisper, but as an ancient force long buried. What emerges is not divine clarity, but everything you have exiled. The shadow enters without permission. It does not knock, it simply appears. And it brings with it the full archive of what the ego has refused to claim. The anger you silenced in the name of peace. The grief you pushed aside to keep functioning. The desires you were told made you shameful. The wounds you tried to patch with perfectionism. All of it returns, not to destroy you, but to be seen. Jung taught that the shadow is composed of all that the conscious mind disowns. But what is repressed does not vanish, it waits. And when the ego loosens its grip, it floods the surface. This is not a punishment, it is a sacred confrontation. Awakening is not a ladder toward bliss, it is a spiral into depth. And that spiral descends before it ever ascends. In the abyss, you begin to see yourself not as you hoped to be, but as you truly are. The image you once built begins to dissolve. You speak words you do not recognize. You act in ways that disturb you. Patterns that once escaped your notice now sting with clarity. But this is not madness. It is a revelation. The unconscious has placed the truth on the table, and that truth will ask everything of you. There is no manual here, no polished answers, only raw presence. This is the trial of soul work, a descent into the underworld of your own psyche. Jung reminded us that the shadow is 90% gold. It holds not just darkness, but the very energy you need to become whole. Creativity, strength, instinct, fire. All the things you denied yourself, all the parts that once felt too much, too dangerous, too wild. They are still here, waiting to be reclaimed. And so you do not slay the shadow, you turn toward it. You listen, you feel, you allow it. And in that moment, something ancient breaks open. Pain, yes, but also power. Because now, you are no longer standing on illusion. You are standing on the truth of your own being. The abyss is not the end. It is the gateway to everything you buried in the name of survival. And only by walking through it can you begin the true work of integration. This is the threshold few speak of, and even fewer truly understand. The sixth stage of awakening is not a transition. It is a dismantling. The collapse of the self you once called me. The version of you built through years of conditioning, achievement, identity, and performance begins to fall apart. Not violently, but with a slow and aching unraveling. What once felt certain loses shape. The roles you inhabited begin to loosen. The dreams you inherited feel hollow. The desires that once lit fires in you now flicker without meaning. And though part of you asked for change, nothing prepares you for the vastness of this inner silence. The world may continue as before. People greet you the same. Your name is still spoken. But you no longer recognize the figure behind the mask. Language feels foreign. Even your reflection carries a distance. You are present, but not entirely here. You try to speak of it, but the words betray the experience. For there is no language for a soul that has outgrown its shell. This is not depression, though it mimics its weight. It is not failure, though it brings humility. It is a death, a psychic death. Carl Jung called this the moment when the ego's illusion of control dissolves. And it must, because the soul cannot rise where the ego still reigns. This space of emptiness is not a punishment, it is a womb. The absence is not void, it is incubation, and what feels like lifelessness is the soil being cleared for something sacred to take root. Here, you are isolated not because you are unloved, but because the next part of your journey cannot be walked with borrowed wisdom. No one can walk you through this threshold. The path forward is not lit by answers, but by silence, a sacred, rearranging silence, the kind that strips everything false until only essence remains. You will feel disoriented, disconnected, and that is part of the ritual. The old self cannot hold what the new self is meant to become. You are in the chrysalis now, and though nothing seems to move, transformation is already happening beneath the stillness. The psyche is composting. The old self returns to dust, so the soul can bloom from the ground of truth. There is no rushing this, no forcing a new beginning. The soul demands a deeper rhythm, one that flows in its own mysterious time. So you learn to wait, not passively, but attentively. You sit with the ache. You breathe into the unknown, and in that raw surrender something stirs. It does not come as a breakthrough, but as a whisper, a subtle sense of aliveness, a breath you did not expect, a flicker of warmth in the cold. That is the beginning of rebirth. Not as a return to who you were, but as the first pulse of who you truly are. After the collapse of the old identity, something begins to reassemble itself within you. It does not arrive with thunder, nor does it declare itself with certainty. It emerges slowly, almost invisibly, through your choices, your silences, your refusal to keep betraying your own voice. This is not a return to the person you were. It is the quiet arrival of someone more real. The seventh stage of awakening is not about becoming someone new, but about allowing what has always been true to finally take form. You begin to notice that you are no longer willing to abandon yourself for approval. There is a new center within you, firm though not loud. You do not need to explain it. You simply begin living from it. You speak more honestly. You say no without guilt. You say yes without compromise. Your relationship with the world shifts. External praise no longer seduces you. External rejection no longer defines you. You are learning to belong to yourself. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the integration of the unconscious with the conscious mind, where the ego is no longer the ruler but the servant of a deeper self. You begin to live from that deeper place. Your intuition becomes sharper, your choices more aligned. You stop reacting to life and start responding to it. You feel less urgency to fix, to please, or to prove. There is peace in simply being what you are, even if the world does not always understand. It is not that the ego disappears. It still whispers, still tries to intervene, but it no longer commands. You feel a sacred distance between you and your conditioning, a gap wide enough to choose again. And from that space, authenticity begins to breathe, not as performance, but as presence. You are not finished. This is not the end. But for the first time, you are no longer pretending. You are walking from the inside out. Your identity no longer clings to the roles assigned by others. It is shaped by truth. And that truth, however fragile, however new, is yours. This is the beginning of inner sovereignty, the moment the self steps forward, not to impress, but to exist. At this stage of the awakening, something uncanny begins to stir between the inner and outer worlds. Synchronicities arrive not as spectacles, but as subtle echoes, moments where reality seems to turn its head and look back at you. Carl Jung defines synchronicity as the meeting of inner meaning and outer event, two paths that converge not by logic, but by soul. It is here, in this mysterious alignment, that the deeper language of the psyche begins to emerge. You are no longer chasing signs. They simply appear, without effort, without agenda. A book falls open to the exact passage your heart needs. A stranger speaks a sentence that mirrors a hidden thought. A symbol repeats itself in dreams and waking life alike. These moments are not meant to impress. They do not promise clarity or resolution. But they whisper, quietly and unmistakably, that something inside you is beginning to resonate with the fabric of the universe. This is not fantasy. It resonates. The psyche, once split between self and world, begins to remember its unity. Your perception softens and expands. You listen with a different ear. You see with a different eye. The world becomes less of a machine and more of a mirror. Dissonance is no longer dismissed. Harmony becomes a kind of music beneath appearances. The ego cannot manufacture these experiences. They arise when you are fully present. They emerge, not from seeking, but from coherence, when who you are and how you live begin to align. And in that alignment, the world reflects your inner truth. It is not superstition, it is a soul dialogue. The unconscious is no longer content to stay hidden. It now speaks in patterns, in poetry, in precise accidents that carry weight. Synchronicity is not a solution. It is not proof. It is a reminder, a sacred nod from the invisible to the visible. And when you trust it, something in you relaxes, not because you know where you are going, but because you finally feel accompanied by something larger. The path may still twist and tangle, but you begin to walk it with the strange confidence of someone who has been seen by the unseen. The concentration. At this point in the journey, something essential begins to surface. It does not arrive with noise or drama, but with quiet insistence. The ninth stage of awakening is marked by the soul's need to speak in its own voice. After passing through the shadow, after surrendering the false self and aligning inner experience with outer synchronicity, a deep shift unfolds. You no longer seek to express what is expected. You begin to express what is true. This expression is not flamboyant. It is not loud or performative. It emerges slowly, like breath returning after being held too long. Your language changes, so does your silence. You start saying less, but each word carries weight. You begin choosing actions that are congruent with what you actually feel, not what will avoid disapproval. You stop asking for permission to exist. And of course, this comes with a rupture. Not everyone will recognize you when you stop performing. The masks you once wore made others comfortable, but now your honesty may unsettle those who have only known your filtered self. Some relationships loosen, others disappear altogether. At first, this loss feels like punishment, but soon you see it for what it is. Alignment. What falls away was never truly resonant. Carl Jung taught that the persona, the mask we present to the world, is necessary but not meant to rule us. When it begins to dissolve, not all at once but through small acts of truth, a deeper self emerges. You stop laughing when something is not funny. You stop nodding when your body says no. You stop filling silence with apologies. You will stumble. There will be moments when you revert to the familiar script, but now something within you notices. The static of self-betrayal hums louder than before. It becomes intolerable. That is the sign of progress. The soul no longer allows distortion to pass unnoticed. It demands coherence. And as you obey that call, your outer world begins to mirror this new truth. Conversations deepen. Creative work takes on meaning. The right people begin to find you, not because you sought them, but because your frequency now speaks clearly. Authentic expression is not about saying everything. It is about living in a way that no longer requires performance. It is the sacred act of standing in your own presence without flinching. Truth, when embodied, does not need volume. It simply needs space. This is the stage where the journey begins to spiral inward in a different way. The 10th stage of spiritual awakening is marked by something quiet, profound, and unmistakable. You no longer merely think about the self, you begin to feel it. Not as an idea, but as a presence. Not as a role, but as a living axis within you. Jung described the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, the archetype of wholeness, that which holds the opposites in tension without needing to resolve them. In this stage, the self ceases to be a distant concept and becomes the center of gravity. You do not reach it through striving. You fall into it, gently, like a leaf drifting to its root. It does not come with fireworks. It arrives with stillness. A deep inner stability begins to take root, not because the world outside has calmed, but because you have stopped demanding that it must. There is now a silence beneath the noise, a clarity beneath the questions. The urge to explain, justify, prove, begins to fade. In its place arises a quiet certainty, not of knowing everything, but of knowing yourself. You stop forcing outcomes. Choices begin to emerge from coherence rather than chaos. There is no longer the compulsion to fix or rescue or control. You listen more, react less. The self does not shout over the world, it simply waits, steady, unmoved, like a compass pointing inward regardless of the storm. In this state, you may still feel fear, loss, confusion, but these no longer swallow you whole. There is space now, and in that space lives something sacred. Freedom. The freedom to respond rather than react, to remain soft even in pain, to walk forward even in uncertainty. Jung called this the essence of individuation, not a final arrival, but a recentering of the entire psyche. The ego is no longer the ruler. It becomes the servant of something deeper. And when that shift occurs, suffering transforms. It becomes less personal, less punishing. You are no longer its prisoner. You begin to live differently, not perfectly, not without error, but with wholeness. You carry your contradictions with grace. You allow the moment to unfold without needing to conquer it. The self, once elusive, now breathes through you, and that alone is enough to anchor your life in meaning, no matter the chaos outside. At this stage, a quiet but profound realization begins to crystallize within you. The outer world is not separate from your inner landscape. What once appeared as coincidence now reveals itself as correspondence. Reality begins to echo the shape of your inner state, not as a mechanical reaction, but as a living mirror responding to the frequency of your presence. Jung observed that the world we encounter is, in many ways, a projection of the psyche, not because we invent it, but because we meet it through the lens of our own becoming. You begin to sense that events are not just happening to you, they are responding to you, not to your ego's desires or surface-level wants, but to the deeper truth you carry. The shift is subtle, but everything changes. You stop blaming the external for your internal storms. You no longer feel like a passive character in life's unfolding drama. Instead, you take your seat as a co-creator, not of outcomes, but of meaning. A loss that once shattered you now becomes an initiation. A delay that once brought frustration now feels like protection. You see the world differently because you inhabit yourself differently. Consciousness gains direction. Your choices are no longer dictated by reaction, but by alignment. You act from a place of grounded awareness rather than fear. And the world, in its own mysterious rhythm, begins to respond. This is not a game of control, it is a sacred reciprocity. You do not bend the world to your will. You walk beside it, awake. You speak and life listens. You listen and life speaks back. The cycles that once repeated endlessly begin to break, not because the world changed, but because you no longer hold the same wound that kept attracting them. Co-creation is not manipulation, it is reverence. It is knowing you are woven into the fabric of existence and that your consciousness ripples through it like light across water. This is the moment awakening becomes embodiment. When the inner transformation begins to move outward, not as performance, but as truth in motion. Every step becomes a conversation. Every breath, a contribution. You are no longer just awakening. You are participating. There comes a moment when the storm settles, not because the sky clears entirely, but because you have learned to stand still in the center of it. The search no longer consumes you, not because you found every answer, but because you discovered something deeper. The questions themselves have transformed. The inner war begins to dissolve. The line between shadow and light, ego and soul, no longer feels like a battlefield, but a sacred meeting ground. What once felt divided within now starts to belong. This is the final movement of awakening, integration, not as a destination, but as a state of being where everything you once rejected is welcomed home. You look at yourself and no longer see an enemy in the mirror. The shame becomes tenderness. The fear becomes deep. The wounds, once hidden, now become thresholds. Nothing needs to be fixed, only felt, embraced, made conscious. Love arises here, not as romance, not as approval, but as presence. It is a frequency, a state of coherence between your essence and your existence. You stop measuring your worth through comparison. You stop asking the world to define you. Instead, you carry yourself with quiet reverence because you know what it took to arrive here. You know the cost of denying yourself. And you know the liberation that comes with finally returning. Jung said that individuation is not about perfection, but about becoming whole. That wholeness includes contradiction, complexity, brokenness, and beauty. It means walking forward without casting aside the pieces that hurt. It means choosing to live without masks, without needing to be understood, without shrinking from your own depth. And that is what love becomes. Not a reward, but a natural expression of the self, finally allowed to exist. This is not an ending. It is a beginning made visible. The spiral continues. The layers unfold. But now you meet them differently, with a deeper breath, a clearer gaze, a steadier soul. You have not become someone else. You have returned to yourself. And that, at last, is the awakening. If this message stirred something inside you, don't stop here. The next video will take you even deeper into the journey of healing, growth, and self-discovery. It might just be the breakthrough your soul has been waiting for. Tap into it now. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join a community committed to truth, transformation, and real inner change. You're not alone on this path. I'll meet you in the next video, where we continue becoming who we were always meant to be.